So will I put my, oh, you've got control there of the content, have you?
Yeah, we'll be starting shortly. Good afternoon. Welcome to Spark to Sport, the first UCC Sport webinar installment. The aim of this webinar is to provide you with a range of stimulating topics on a wide variety of subjects evolving around sport. My name is Jeff Gomez, and I am the High Performance Manager for UCC Sport and the Mardak Arena UCC. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, I will be hosting a series of topics and speakers ranging from high performance to the coaching environment. By creating this webinar, my desire is to introduce you to a platform that can generate a multifaceted discussion around sport via a wide variety of guests and different point of views. So, my first guest, who kindly accepted to start the webinar, is Trevor Woods. Trevor is the exercise physiologist in UCC. He has been working with and testing countless talented athletes over the years and was recently coordinating the launch of the Keep Well UCC website platform. As a competitive triathlete himself for over 3 decades, he has won numerous races and awards. He competed in the 2002 Commonwealth Games triathlon. He won bronze and silver medals at World and European Triathlon Championships. He competed in several Ironmans, and the list goes on and on. The reason I asked Trevor to participate in this webinar is to give us a little bit more of a granular view on exercising, and more importantly, why it is so important to remain active. So, Trevor, welcome to the webinar. And to start it off, can you tell us why do we need to consider activity in our daily routine and lifestyle?
Okay, thank you, Jeff, and I'd like to welcome you all again to this presentation. So yes, to answer that question, I suppose that's what I plan to cover. I suppose in the coming slides, I'm going to talk about the reasons of why we need to exercise, but also how we can go about that. How we can integrate exercise easily and efficiently into our daily lives. So for the next, I suppose, 20-25 minutes, I'm going to look at some of the issues around physical activity. I'm going to define it for you, so you know what we're actually referring to when we talk about physical activity. I'm going to examine the importance of integrating it into our lives. There is currently a huge body of evidence, showing multiple health benefits as well as fitness benefits to be gained from engaging in regular exercise, and despite that, there's still the participation rates of physical activity within Ireland are still quite low. Recent surveys showed there's only 32% of adults meet the recommended guidelines. So we can clearly do with improving that. So I will then look at some guidelines that there are there at present. These are reflected globally, and I'm going to look at some considerations around those. So I'll finish off then with some practical tips. Just on keeping active during the current time, some practical tips on keeping healthy during the current pandemic, and then I'll link up some key resources that the listeners can refer to to get further information. So the title of my talk is Physical Activity, Why and How. Here to the next slide. Jeff, I'm just trying to advance to the next slide there. Any idea?
That should be there now. Yeah, it's all good. You're live.
No, it's not going to the next slide. Any idea how we can?
I don't know.
Let's see here. Sorry, folks, if you just bear with us a second. Just want to get to the next slide. Oh, this worked before for us, didn't it, Jeff?
Yeah, so
No, I've got, it won't seem to advance to the next slide for me here.
So, Luke, while we're trying to troubleshoot the slides, you mentioned there's only 32% of activity in islands. Do you know why such a low level of activity?
Well, I suppose, you know, some recent surveys over the last couple of days actually showed that if anything, physical activity rates are actually decreasing with the current lockdown. Now, that's probably in contrast to what many people would think, because if you go out, you only have to go out to the street to see more people cycling, running, doing exercise, walking. But some recent surveys have shown that activity rates are actually decreasing over recent weeks. And given the importance of engaging in regular exercise for both physical and mental health, you know, that's not the direction we want that to go currently. Why they're so low? Well, I suppose it's multifaceted, and I guess we need to look at not only at an individual level, but at an environmental level. We need to consider individuals' access to leisure facilities, to open spaces to do exercise. We need to consider their level of education on what is the easy way and what's the best way to go about getting physical activity. So, you know, the rates of physical activity amongst the population have increased gradually over recent years. I think that number was in the high 20s and low 30s some years ago, and that it is gradually increasing. So, you know, efforts are being made to increase activity levels, and it's certainly working. But it's got a long way to go. So what I'll do, look, what I can do is talk with to the slides. I can't seem to advance to the next slide for some reason. So what I was going to do is just define what physical activity is, and the main, you know, the common definition out there is it's any bodily movement produced by the skeletal muscles which causes energy expenditure, and that's greater than rest, and which is health enhancing. And that was a definition by the World Health Organization back a number of years ago. And that virtually includes all types of physical movement, including, it could be active play, it could be walking, it could be cycling, dance, games, even includes gardening and housework. So any domestic chores will come under that definition. Physical inactivity, then, on the other hand, which is essentially sedentary behaviour, that has been identified as the fourth leading cause of or risk factor for global mortality. So sedentary behaviour is not good for our physical nor for our mental health, and so, you know, efforts are being made to increase this, and you know, they need to be continued. So the physical activity levels in Ireland, as I said, a recent survey in 2018 did show that physical activity rates were, for the adult population, were averaging in around 33%, and that was the percentage of the population that were hitting the recommended guidelines. Now, we'll come on to the guidelines in a few minutes, but that is low. That's not ideally where we want it. We are ahead of some nations, but we're behind other nations globally. So what is so good about physical activity? So you mentioned earlier, Jeff, why do we need to consider exercise? Well, you know, there were some great ancient philosophers, such as Plato, back in 400 BC, and he was quoted as saying that lack of physical activity destroys the good condition of every human being, while movement and methodical physical exercise save it and preserve it. And so, you know, it was known back as far as then that some physical exercise, physical movement, is good for our bodies. But it was not until, I suppose, some landmark studies in the 1950s that showed that physical inactivity was associated with increased risk of coronary heart disease, and numerous other problems. And there was a classic study that compared two groups of workers in London on double-decker buses. They compared essentially the drivers, who were sedentary, sitting for almost 90% of their shift, and they compared that to the conductors, who were physically quite active. Sometimes they were climbing maybe 500, 600, 700 steps per day. And despite them coming from similar social classes, the physically active conductors had much lower rates of coronary heart disease than the physically inactive drivers. And that was there was quite significant differences there. And that was one of the very initial studies, and there's been many since that have looked at the importance of physical activity. And you can see with that example that wasn't formal exercise that those conductors were doing. That was just integrated into their job, their profession. So we have defined physical activity, and we have looked at maybe why it's important, but essentially what everybody wants to know is, well, what are the benefits for me? Why is it good that I do some exercise? Well, if you look at if you do a search, a Google search of the benefits of exercise, you'll find a plethora of studies showing evidence of significant gains for physical and mental health. And certainly, as an exercise physiologist, having tested hundreds and thousands of athletes, players, and even novice individuals over the years, I can certainly vouch for the physiological gains to be had in terms of cardiorespiratory fitness, muscular strength fitness, and as well as weight control. And so currently there's very strong evidence across a whole list of the benefits to be had for our overall health. I suppose one key underlying cause that always strikes my attention is there are many diseases and disorders that are linked with inflammation. We look at cancer, we look at heart disease, or diabetes, and there is very strong evidence that exercise can reduce a number of very key inflammatory markers that are linked to these diseases. These key markers would be, for example, C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, and there's mounting evidence of how exercise can benefit our mental health also. That's always fascinated me, and how studies have shown that physical activity can help treat depression, can be far more effective than medication, and that low activity levels are a big risk factor for it. There is a very clear antidepressant effect of exercise, and that seems to be in part moderated by through serotonin levels. Listeners have probably heard of serotonin. It's the sort of happy chemical, and in part through what's called bone-derived neurotrophic factor. It's BDNF. This protein is basically like fertilizer for your brain, if you like. So it helps to protect healthy cells that you have, but also helps form new connections, and this is really vital for learning and for memory. And indeed, exercise is one of the best ways to achieve this. So, or to increase your levels of BDNF. And there's also strong evidence that exercise can trigger new brain cell growth, and thus can help with cognitive function, and that's particularly vital for older adults. It's important for at all ages, of course, but there's very good evidence that there are reductions in conditions like dementia and Alzheimer's with those that do regular exercise. So, and another big improvement or another big benefit is for our immune system, and that's certainly very prevalent at the moment, but regular exercise has got clear benefits for our immune system strength. However, on the flip side, consistent overreaching, overtraining, over-exercising, and under recovering, so not getting adequate sleep, not getting adequate nutrition, this will clearly compromise our immune defenses and is highly counterproductive. So we need to be mindful of this, particularly in times of high stress. So if, during the current time, we have some listeners doing exams, they're trying to study long hours, They're not getting any exercise. They're maybe neglecting their sleep. So they need to be mindful of that compromise. But on the whole, looking at many of these benefits, generally speaking, you can see a 20, 30, sometimes up to 40% risk reduction in the disease risk, in the rate at which an individual can suffer from these conditions. So in my opinion, exercise is clearly a no-brainer. So how much physical activity do we need? What do we need to do? How much? I often get the question, asked the question, what is the least exercise I can get away with doing in the week that will give me health benefits and will keep me somewhat fit? It's not. There are certainly some indications of the minimum amounts that are needed. However, that will vary from person to person. So I guess back even in the 70s, the American College of Sports Medicine, they released guidelines, and these were the first guidelines that came on stream, and they were quite simple. Adults should try to exercise 3 times a week on non-consecutive days at a vigorous intensity for about 30 minutes. So that was three simple exercise sessions of 30 minutes per week. That was updated then around the mid-90s. When those guidelines were increased to 30 minutes of moderate intensity exercise most days of the week. And then later, in the early 2000s, they emerged, new guidelines emerged then stating that adults would gain substantial health benefits from about 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity exercise, or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity exercise, or even a combination of the two. And I suppose since then, since around 2008, those guidelines have held, and that would be what the current advice is. But additionally, it's recommended that adults incorporate some muscle strengthening exercises at least 2 days a week. So that's in addition to the aerobic exercise of 150 minutes. But it's important to note that this physical activity recommendation can be met through a combination of vigorous and moderate. So, not everybody wants to engage in regular vigorous exercise, and by the same token, they don't always want to do moderate. So a mix of the two is quite appropriate also. So, for example, a person might exercise vigorously for 30 minutes on only twice a week, and on the other days they might do a short brisk walk once, twice per day. And then there's also guidelines for children. For young people, they're slightly different in that they entail up to 60 minutes of physical activity every day. But ideally, this should include working on things like agility, on coordination, on balance. So ideally, those sort of movements should be incorporated, I guess, into the whatever activities they do. And I suppose we've all heard then of the importance of developing fundamental movement skills at a young age, and so they're running, you're jumping, you're throwing. So again, it's prudent to try to include some of those movements into whatever activities are done, particularly for children, to develop their, I suppose, what we call their physical literacy, and also to build their confidence. So is the 150 minutes per week? People ask me, do I need to do 150 minutes per week? Clearly, like, I work with athletes who 150 minutes a day would be seen as extremely easy. They would easily exceed that every day of the week. For others, they can't imagine even doing half of that in an entire week. So, it really has to be on an individual basis. But 150 minutes, we can always ask the question: do we need to do that? Do we have to be, and also do we have to be super fit to actually gain the benefits, the health benefits? Well, there was a landmark study by Stephen Blair back in the late 80s, and that sort of reshaped the way that exercise scientists and trainers thought about exercise programming. And the study compared levels of all-cause mortality across different fitness levels in men and women. And clearly, the least fit men and least fit women had significantly higher rates of mortality, but there was a tremendous difference in the mortality rate between the least fit and then the second least fit groups, indicating that mortality was reduced substantially with even a moderate increase in fitness. So if you went from being totally unfit to being even very, very slightly fit, there was a substantial drop in the disease risk, essentially. Of course, those improvements continued to be gained with increased fitness, but you didn't need to be super fit to get the health benefits of exercise. So in other words, this classic study really showed that it's possible to get most of the health benefits of physical activity at a level that's much lower than what is necessary to improve fitness. So, and then recent evidence has also challenged this 150-minute sort of threshold centered message that has come out globally. The problem is that it creates this unnecessary barrier to those who might benefit greatly from simply just becoming more active. In other words, some individuals might say, well, there's no way I can achieve 50 minutes of moderate intensive exercise a week, so I'll just not do anything. But the main message, hopefully getting through there now, is that anything is better than nothing, and even if it's half that, a quarter of that, you can still gain in terms of your overall health if you engage in that at that level. And so, when someone does exercise, the other thing we need to consider is the intensity. How do we gauge intensity? There's many ways to gauge intensity. We can simply go by perceived rating of exertion. So listeners might be familiar with the Borg scale of effort, and essentially what we want when we're doing moderate intensity exercise is that it should feel close to somewhat hard, not difficult. That's getting up into the vigorous intensities, and so ideally you should be a little bit breathless. Some people use the analogy that you should pretend or almost imagine you're a little bit late for an appointment. So you're walking a little bit faster than you would normally, and that would be a good moderate intensity. Of course, you can use heart rate monitors. Many athletes would train routinely with heart rate, with a Garmin to gauge speed, to measure power on a cycle, a bicycle. So there are many ways of gauging intensity, and it's important to have some metric there to go by, even if it is entirely just perceived by yourself. So we're moving along with time. It's about 20. I've been talking for about 25 minutes, but what I'm going to do is I had two final slides just to look at practical tips that I think would be some of the most important there at the moment to stay in order to stay physically active, but also in order to stay healthy. So,
sorry, Trevor, before we move on to the practical tips, I wanted to ask you a question that you briefly brushed upon a minute ago about the intensity of exercise. At the moment, we are in a very, very kind of unusual environment with this COVID-19. And when, for example, when I go for a jog, I never met that amount of joggers on my path. That's incredible amount of people exercising, which is great. However, there's a distinct risk of potential overtraining. And I remember reading an article a couple of years ago about your career. And I remember, I believe you trained in Australia at one point. And I remember that you went to a little bit into the overtraining. Would you be able to maybe talk to our listeners about what is overtraining firstly, and what are the main signs of overtraining, and when it's time to say, okay, I need to take a break?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I suppose the term overtraining has been around for quite some time. Traditionally, that was the phrase that was used, but more recently, it's become accepted that the terms of overreaching, functional overreaching, and then into non-functional overreaching have been used extensively. So essentially, I suppose what overtraining or non-functional overreaching is when you get a scenario where an athlete, or it could be a player, could be it doesn't even have to be an athlete, but an individual has been consistently training at a level that they're not allowing adequate recovery from those sessions. So it could be caused by poor nutrition, lack of recovery. It could be simply because the volume of training has increased so rapidly that their body is not able to, I suppose, to adapt efficiently. So when you train, you fatigue your body. After a training session, you're somewhat fatigued. Within a day or two, you're fully recovered again. And of course, many individuals may go on, for example, to training camp, and they might deliberately train hard for 1 or 2 weeks. And yes, they come home and they're quite fatigued. And as long as they can program in a recovery period, that may be a week, it may be longer, then they regenerate, they recover, and they adapt to the training load that they've put themselves under, and that's fine. However, if you consistently under recover, so you neglect those key recovery tools such as sleep, such as quality nutrition, such as controlling the volume of the training program, the intensity of the loads, then you will eventually or run a high risk of developing overtraining as a result of that. What are the symptoms? Well, I think some of the research would certainly show that the clearest symptoms there tend to be underperformance. So if you're consistently seeing that you're underperforming, now how you judge that may be on your a quality effort where you're trying to hold a certain speed or cover a certain distance in a certain time, but you consistently are starting to underperform. You're feeling increasingly fatigued, but also some of the more sensitive markers tend to be in relation to your mood state. So typically athletes who are overtrained have more sensitivity to being cranky, to being in a bad mood, to being depressed. So there are some psychological indicators there that tend to be very, very reliable as well. So yeah, I did develop problems with overtraining years ago on a few occasions, but I guess I was in a position where I could educate myself on what was the best way to get out of it, what was the best way, and subsequently what was the best way to avoid it happening again in the future. I contracted a tropical virus when I was working overseas due to some insect bites, and ended up in hospital for 1.5 weeks, bedridden, and not able to function physically very well for quite some time after that. And it took me months and months to gradually build up my physical and as well as mental reserves again. And it took time. It took time, and it took a lot of concerted effort with nutrition, with sleep, with a positive mindset. So there were a lot of things that fed into recovering from that. Eventually, I got there, but unfortunately, for many athletes that I've heard of, they haven't been so fortunate, and they've had their careers destroyed because of being pushed too hard for too long.
And can I ask you, nowadays, in this environment, between everything that you learned as a triathlete, as an exercise physiologist, and this current environment, what kind of guidelines and practical tips could you give to people? Because at the moment, if you're an athlete with all that time that you have and all that level of uncertainty, and the only thing that you do that that is comfortable as an athlete is to train, and therefore, if it's comfortable, you're gonna want to train instead of turning on Netflix. You're gonna want to train. So what kind of guidelines and structure could you recommend to people that they can practically put together?
Yeah, so of course, I think there certainly will be a cohort of individuals out there that, under the current circumstances, they have much more time on their hands, and they feel like, well, this is a great opportunity now to train like a pro athlete, train round the clock, and get super fit for when the competition season starts again. I think, you know, I would highly recommend that that's not what individuals do at the moment. I think it should be used as an opportunity to, you know, for example, go back to some basic fundamental training, work on cardiovascular fitness, of course, work on strength, work on maybe areas of their body that they have in the past been somewhat injury prone to. So, you know, we've seen there's countless online classes available nowadays on Pilates and yoga and doing various strength exercises. And I think they're great. And I think many athletes, certainly that I've worked with in the past, would typically have neglected that whole area of strength and mobility and flexibility. And I think it would be great to integrate that a degree of that training into their current programs. But of course, a lot of it comes down to having some kind of structure and routine at the moment. We all need a routine, but of course, the idea is to keep that routine balanced. So, you know, there needs to be some time for socializing with friends and family. There needs to be time for relaxation. You know, you need to do some brain activity. You can't just train a lot of the day and neglect our brain fitness. So doing puzzles and crosswords and things like that can be very good. But essentially do something that you enjoy every day. Yes, physical exercise, physical training is important, and especially for those listeners who are regular training athletes and they're used to that routine, then absolutely that has to be kept up. That's what they're used to, that's what they want to do. But I think it now should not be the time to all of a sudden double or triple the training load because of that risk of overtraining. And currently, you know, with the pandemic ongoing, we need to ensure that we keep our immune system strong. And overtraining is a classic reason for a weakened immune system. So we need to focus on those three big pillars of getting adequate sleep, eating well, having good nutrition, of course, and doing the physical activity, but not overdoing that physical activity.
Thank you. In terms of nutrition, and just briefly, because we only have a few minutes left, I know you're not a nutritionist, but is there any vitamins or supplements that people should consider? For example, I'm thinking, due to the lockdown, so many people are spending countless amount of hours indoors. Would, for example, vitamin D3 will be an adequate supplement or vitamins to take?
Absolutely, and that's you're exactly right. Particularly with the not only the elderly individuals listening that were having to basically stay indoors during the recent lockdowns. So, you know, our best and most natural source of vitamin D3 is sunshine, and you know, the weather is starting to improve now. We're getting more sunshine during daylight hours, and it's important to get your skin exposed to some of that for a period of I would recommend at least 20 to 30 minutes at least per day, if you can. But of course, if that's not possible, or if you want to supplement on that, then a vitamin D supplement is very, very easy, very cheap to take, and it would be highly recommended currently to do so. I think that, you know, the recommended intake would be in and around maybe up to 400 or 500 international units per day, and there are again a range of benefits from taking or ensuring that your vitamin D levels are adequate. We all know that it's important for bone health, but there's some recent evidence showing it's important for immunity, for the prevention of cancers. So it's a no-brainer, certainly in my opinion, to take a vitamin D3. In terms of other supplements that are going to help, I think that any nutritionist will say the same, that healthy whole food diet that focuses on plenty of fruit and veg, lean proteins, whole grains, water, plenty of water to hydrate, that is your best bet to stay to have a healthy diet. And yes, we can all take a multivitamin as a little backup, as a bit of security. If you feel you need to do that, then that can be taken. But certainly the vitamin D3 would be one that I would highly recommend to the athletes that I work with.
Thank you. We have one question before we wrap it up, which is what are the implications for athletes returning to optimum condition if and when they can return to training and competition? Is there a higher risk of injury and what can they do to avoid this?
Okay, like I suppose again, a lot of individuals who would be used to competing and training, and you know, they're afraid to lose condition, they're afraid to lose fitness in case that all of a sudden competitions come on stream in the next couple of weeks and they want to be physically ready for those. I think the reality is that there may, you know, there will be plenty of notice given for when competitions are getting back on stream, and I think that if an individual uses the current time to maintain a basic level of fitness, go back to working on strength, on mobility, on maybe areas that they traditionally wouldn't have I suppose focused on, then I think you give yourself the best chance to that when there are competitions in the near future, you will have the ability then to start stepping up your training and start to engage in more race specific training in order to prepare fully for competitions. I think that the important thing for an athlete who is used to competing is that they don't try to maintain that sharpness and that almost race specific fitness currently. It's not needed. And you know, Jeff, as well as any other coach, there's only so long you can hold peak condition. So you do certainly not need to be in peak condition at the moment. But when the time comes to start increasing the training load again, the training frequency, again, the exact same principles apply as with anyone on a training program. It's gradual progression. It's a case of gradually building up the intensity and the volume again in readiness for the racing season.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's important there, returning back to training, is firstly, what is the goal? What are you trying to accomplish, and what can you control right now? And slowly incorporating all those steps into a very specific plan. Not just go out there and start running and training. It just have a plan, be ready, and control your different parameters of training, and just make sure that you're not overtraining and not, you know, exercising all the time because you got all the time on your hands. So look, Trevor, thank you very much. Thanks for logging in. It was an absolute pleasure to have you. So guys, thank you for logging in. Thanks for your time. Tomorrow morning, 1 o'clock, we'll welcome Kieran Sheehan, with is an ex AFL player. He's currently Cork footballers, and I will be welcoming him at 1 o'clock to talk about his experience down under. Thank you so much for logging in. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.